All right. Hi, everyone. Today we are going to talk about Scrum. So let's dive right into it. Scrum, which is short for scrummage, is a method of restarting play that involves play. Sorry, hold on. This is the wrong slide. Let's see. Disambiguation, rugby, press conference, truck, Slayer, software. There we go. Sorry about that. Scrum is a framework for agile software development in which the product is going to be built in a series of fixed length iterations, which we call sprints. And the advantage of doing things in sprints is it gives teams a framework for shipping on a regular cadence. This is especially a reaction to kind of old school software teams where often a product was only shipped once a year or maybe at most once a quarter. Scrum is about shipping regularly, getting things out the door on a regular basis so that you can react more quickly, more agilely to the needs of the market. Milestones, like the end of the sprint, come frequently, and they bring with them a feeling of tangible progress. And these short iterations reinforce the importance of good estimation and fast feedback from tests. As I was working on this presentation, one of those tweets came up that was just like, it was so timely and so perfect for my presentation, I had to include it. I love what this guy says. To be clear, apathy is not a moral failing. It's a rational coping mechanism in unhealthy environments. Do you want an apathetic software team? Pressure them to meet aggressive, arbitrary deadlines or exert undue control over how they do their work. I think what you'll find is that Scrum is all about reacting to these two particular things. It's about making teams feel empowered and making things more clear. So let's talk about the Scrum values real fast. The Scrum Manifesto outlines these very early on, and they seem kind of highbrow and abstract, but trust me, they literally inform every aspect of how you do Scrum. First of all, transparency. Nothing happens in the dark. The product backlog is visible, estimates are shared, velocity is tracked, the definition of done is clear. There should not be anything that a developer doesn't know why it's happening. Inspection. Scrum artifacts are inspected frequently, but not so frequently it gets in the way of work. We'll talk about that more later, but this is things like at the end of the sprint, you look back at the work you did and make sure that you're on target. And most importantly, adaption. If something isn't working, we adjust course as quickly as possible. Again, the advantage of that rapid release cycle is you can change. If the request from your client changes, if the needs of the market change, you're not locked into a 6-month development cycle. So let's talk about the Scrum team itself, because if you're not familiar with Scrum, it has a slightly different team makeup than you may be used to in a more traditional agile or software development setting. The Scrum team is going to be made up of 3 roles. First of all, you have the product owner. Second of all, you have the development team standing back there chuckling and admiring their work. And lastly, you have the Scrum master. Before we get into details on any of them, I want to talk for a moment about how teams grow and learn how to work together. You may have seen a chart like this before. This forming, storming, norming, performing idea has been around for many years. But the basic idea is when a team first gets together, they don't understand process, they don't understand each other, and they're very inefficient. Eventually, as they start storming, the process becomes clear, but the team still hasn't really learned how to work together. And then eventually they get to norming, where they understand each other, they understand their goals and their processes and their workflow, and eventually the team gets to performing, where everything's working right. They're just ticking right along. But here's the catch. It's impossible to reach that performing stage if the members of the team are constantly changing. This is something, a lot of organizations suffer from is kind of constant reorgs. Under Scrum, you want to make sure to put a Scrum team together and keep that group together as long as humanly possible, because the longer they're together, the more accurate their estimates will get and the more productive they get as a team. So let's talk about the first role on the team, the product owner. The product owner is a champion of their product. This is kind of a weird phrase to say, but Scrum kind of outlines that each of the three roles champion one particular aspect of development. In the case of the product owner, obviously what they're a champion of is the product itself. The product owner is one person. It is not a committee. If you're working in an area where you have to take product guidance from multiple people or a group of stakeholders, that's not okay under Scrum. They need to get together and nominate one person. Even if that group still exists, they nominate one person who's responsible for interacting with the Scrum team. The product owner is focused on understanding business and market requirements, and then prioritizing the work the dev team does according to those requirements. And last of all, they are responsible for managing the product backlog, which they're going to do using their understanding of the market needs. And the last point I want to make is product owners are not project managers. There are a lot of things that we expect project managers to do that either aren't handled by the product owner or are handled by other parts of the Scrum process or simply aren't relevant to Scrum. So in your head, even though they sound kind of similar, kind of separate these out. Product owner is responsible for understanding the business requirements and prioritizing the work. So up next, let's talk about the development team. The development team are champions of sustainable development practices. I've highlighted the word sustainable there. I think it is more important than a lot of people understand. Scrum is a methodology that's all about getting your team to be as productive as possible, but it's getting your team to be as productive as possible in a sustainable way. We're talking about marathons, not sprints. You don't want people to burn out. You don't want people to burn the candle at both ends, or any other metaphors that you choose to apply here. But they care about doing work as efficiently as possible and getting as much work done as possible in a way that the team can sustain sprint after sprint after sprint. The dev team is going to consist of 3 to 9 professionals. These numbers sound kind of arbitrary, but the Scrum Guide basically just says, look, if it's more than 9 people, the group gets unwieldy, and if it's fewer than 3 people, you don't really have a team. The development team is responsible for planning the sprint and for delivering a potentially releasable increment of done work. We're going to talk a lot about this as we move forward, but this is kind of the root of Scrum, is that the development team makes a commitment to the product owner to release a body of work that the product owner has prioritized. So the development team can't commit to releasing the right work unless the product owner does their job of prioritizing the backlog. So there's kind of this virtuous cycle here where they depend on each other. The development team is self-organizing. All this means is that no one, not even the Scrum Master, gets to tell the dev team how to work. Now, obviously, they need to work within the Scrum framework itself, but what this is talking about is like how you do code reviews, what code tools you use, what build processes you use. It doesn't matter. Scrum says the dev team has complete control over how they do the work. They are only responsible for committing to a delivery at the end. How they get to that delivery point is completely up to the dev team. And finally, the development team is cross-functional. And all this means is that they have all the people on the team that they need in order to deliver the work that they're committing to. A good example here is in a lot of organizations, the dev team is composed of programmers, but there's maybe only one database administrator at the company. So everyone has to compete for the database administrator's resources. Under Scrum, you don't want to have a situation where the Scrum team is sitting around twiddling their thumbs because they can't do any work because they're dependent on a resource outside the team. So ideally, you're going to have everyone that you need embedded within the development team. The final member of the Scrum team is the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is a champion of process within the team. They're here to coach the team and the business on the Scrum methodology and look for ways to fine-tune the process. They're responsible for resolving impediments for the dev team and insulating them from external disruptions when possible. If you do end up with something where, hey, I can't complete this ticket that we committed to because we're waiting on requirements from this person outside the team, the Scrum Master is responsible for going and finding that person and telling them, hey, my team is blocked until I get this commitment from you. And finally, the Scrum Master is responsible for defending against common Scrum anti-patterns. And there's one in particular that the Scrum guidelines call out, which is changing a sprint's scope after it's begun. Product owners will often, at the beginning, not really understand why sprints are locked. And it gets back to that thing we've talked about with sprints are commitment. We're going to talk about this more later, but in a nutshell, product owners will sometimes ask, can't we just get this one more super important little thing into this sprint? But keeping the scope that the team has committed to airtight helps to reinforce good estimation and product planning, and it fends off a source of disruption to the development team. So yeah, we'll talk about that more later, but it's the Scrum Master's responsibility to push back against that anti-pattern. And it's worth mentioning that the Scrum Master is also not a project manager. So let's talk briefly about what happens if there's no dedicated Scrum Master. I've worked at more companies who do Scrum but don't have Scrum Masters than I have companies with dedicated Scrum Masters. It's not great, that's not the ideal situation. But there are ways around it. The first thing you want to watch out for if you don't have a dedicated Scrum Master is to avoid conflicts of interest. Your product owner should not act as the Scrum Master. There should be a degree of tension. Like the product owner and the Scrum Master can be friendly and they can work together, but their goals are sometimes conflicting, right? The product owner is pushing to get as much work done as possible. The Scrum Master is pushing to make sure that process is followed and that the dev team is working in a sustainable way. If the product owner is acting as a Scrum Master, they're incentivized to violate Scrum process. So definitely I would recommend do not have your product owner act as a Scrum Master. Instead, what I would recommend is have members of the dev team rotate who's acting as Scrum Master during each sprint. So developer A is Scrum Master on sprint A, developer B is Scrum Master on sprint B, etc., etc. The thing that's really cool about this, I've found, is that it actually helps inject fresh ideas into the Scrum process. Scrum Masters are like anyone else. They're people, right? They have parts of the process that they're very passionate about. They have parts that they don't care as much about. When I've worked on teams where we had a rotating Scrum Master role, it was really cool because, this sprint, Josh is the Scrum Master, and boy, Josh really cares about stand-up moving quickly. So he brought a timer in to stand up, and he really helped us get used to giving our stand-up updates quickly. And when Charlie was Scrum Master, he cared a lot about retrospectives. He thought we weren't doing retrospectives right, so he brought a renewed focus on retrospectives, et cetera, et cetera. It can help avoid the team stagnating or falling into a rut. So again, if you don't have a dedicated Scrum Master, I would say rather than picking a particular engineer, try rotating it through the development team and as a result, you kind of shine fresh light on the process every sprint. In order from best to worst, I would say your best case scenario is you have a dedicated Scrum Master. Not quite as good. Some companies can only afford to have one Scrum Master on staff, and they will assign them to 2 different Scrum teams, and they kind of have to run back and forth between them. That's not great. I mean, it's great to have a dedicated resource, but now they've got to split their time. They've got to make sure their meetings don't overlap. It's kind of a hassle. Third best would be having an engineer acting as your Scrum Master. And of course, the worst case scenario is nobody is acting as Scrum Master at all. Okay, so that brings us to the Scrum rituals themselves. Scrum rituals are prescribed events that create regularity and minimize the need for meetings that aren't defined under Scrum. Now, this is the part where I usually see developers getting really excited, like, oh, less meetings? Go on, you have my attention. The thing that I like to point out at this point is Scrum has a number of meetings that are defined that are going to happen on a regular basis, and those can seem like a lot when you initially see them on your calendar. But it's helpful to understand that what Scrum does is it formalizes conversations that were already happening, but they weren't acknowledged and recognized in the calendar. So by putting them on the calendar and giving them a reserved, regular cadence, it actually frees up a lot of time elsewhere, and you should find yourself getting pulled into a lot less ad hoc meetings. Under Scrum, all events are time-boxed. Again, this comes back to we're doing this on a regular cadence. We're having a Scrum every 2 weeks or whatever. So it's less critical that we cover every single thing in a meeting because we're going to have another meeting in X number of weeks. Other than the sprint itself, which is kind of the container for all these other meetings, each event is a formal opportunity to inspect and adapt. There are those values again, right? We want to inspect how we're doing the work, and we want to adapt if it's not doing what we need. So that brings us to the first thing, the sprint. The sprint itself is a fixed length of work during which a done, usable, and potentially releasable product increment is created. We talked about this a little earlier. Once the sprint has started, it's not allowed to make any changes that would endanger the sprint goal. And that includes adding user stories or changing sprint length. For example, if we've decided to do a 2-week sprint, it's not okay to come in the middle of the sprint and say, okay, now it's a 1-week sprint. No, we made a commitment to deliver a certain amount of work based on having a certain amount of time. Sprint cancellations. I hesitated about whether to put this line in at all because sprint cancellations are very uncommon, and the Scrum guide itself calls them out as traumatic to the Scrum team. That seems like a dramatic word, but I think it's worth emphasizing. Canceling a sprint is a big deal. When a sprint is canceled, any completed and done items that are in the backlog can be released, but anything that is incomplete, including things that are in progress. You might have a task that's 20% done. You might have a task that's 50% done. You might have a task that's 80% done. It doesn't matter. If it's incomplete, they all get put back into the backlog, and then they have to be re-estimated. And the thing that I think non-developers sometimes don't understand is that code goes stale quickly. It depreciates in value, right? If I have a branch for a feature today and you tell me to walk away from it, but you ask me to go back to it in 2 days, I can probably do that pretty easily. You ask me to go back to it in a week, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to have some significant merge conflicts. You ask me to go back to it in a month, man, I might as well just throw that branch out. It is probably worthless at this point because the core code base will have changed so much in the meantime. How long is a sprint? The short answer is 2 weeks is pretty standard. They can range anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. You can get more done in a longer sprint, but you're less capable of reacting to changes. I like to make the analogy that having a 1-week sprint is like driving a speedboat. It's very fast, it's very nimble, you can turn quickly, but you can't carry a lot in it. Where a 4-week sprint is like driving a freighter barge. You can put a ton of cargo on there, but that thing is going to take a half hour to turn left. 2 weeks kind of splits the difference. 2 weeks means you're capable of reacting to anything within 2 weeks, and it's long enough that the developers can get a pretty significant amount of work done. Keeping the sprint length consistent is important. It gives the dev team critical feedback on estimation and delivery process, makes forecasts increasingly accurate. It kind of doesn't matter what number you pick. There are going to be product owners who prefer a shorter sprint. There are going to be product owners who prefer a longer sprint. As long as your team agrees and you stick with it, it'll all balance out in the end. Okay, so let's talk about our second ritual, product backlog grooming. This is a meeting where the team is going to review and estimate user stories in the product backlog. This meeting is going to take about 1 hour per week of sprint. So if you're doing 2-week sprints, it's going to be a 2-hour meeting. It could happen anytime, but it often is scheduled for the first day of the sprint. Or if you're doing 2-week sprints, sometimes you'll schedule it for the alternate Monday in the middle, just to avoid loading up that first Monday with so many meetings. The attendees are going to be the entire Scrum team. And the purpose of the meeting is for the product owner to get help with the product backlog. This is something I'm going to kind of emphasize when I talk about these rituals, is kind of who owns them. I think that can be really helpful because sometimes the purpose of the meetings feels like they overlap a little bit. So it's worth understanding what the purpose of them is. In this case, the purpose is for the rest of the team to help the product owner do their job. Okay, I've mentioned the product backlog a number of times. Let's talk about what that is. The product backlog is pretty simple. It's just an ordered list of user stories for every feature that we know needs to be in the product. It's going to be the single source of requirements for any changes that have to be made to the product. So you shouldn't have 2 backlogs. You shouldn't have like a list over here and a list over there. There's one product backlog. The product owner is responsible for the backlog, including content, availability, and ordering. And importantly, a product backlog is never complete. It is a red flag if your product owner comes in, populates a backlog, and then never touches it again. It's a product backlog should be constantly evolving and reorganizing itself based on the needs of the market. I mentioned that the product backlog is composed of user stories. If you're not familiar with user stories, they're a way of formalizing feature requests. So we usually follow this sentence structure. We say, as this type of user, I want this functionality so that I can receive this benefit, right? As a customer on the SpaceX tourism website, I want to be able to buy a ticket to the moon so that I can fly to the moon. As a customer on Amazon.com, I want to be able to review my past purchases so that I can find out how much money I spent in 2016. Usually user stories are sketched out by the product owner, and they should describe a problem, not prescribe a solution. We often run into a problem where if your product owner has a technical background, they sometimes jump forward to, okay, I need you to add the following row to the database, or I need you guys to add a new function that does the following things. You really want to push back on the product owners doing that. The product owners are responsible for describing the problem. They might understand the best technical solution, but they also might not. And if they describe a technical solution, your dev team is going to take that as an order. They're going to go, okay, great, I need to go add this technical constraint. But if you describe the problem, they might go, oh, you thought you wanted us to add a row to the database, but we can actually do it this other way, and it'll be much better. The dev team is going to help the product owner refine these user stories during backlog grooming. by asking a series of questions, such as, can this be done? Do we need any more information before we start this work? And should this be broken up into smaller stories? Sometimes a feature request is so broad that it actually needs to be broken up into many smaller stories. So how do we estimate? We talked about how the stories in the backlog need to be estimated. If you've heard of planning poker, the dev team is going to use planning poker to assign story points to each of these user stories. Planning poker just means they're going to go around the table, they're going to make sure that everyone understands the problem, and then they're all going to say, I think the story is this difficult. And they're going to keep talking about it until they come to a consensus. So often you'll have everyone at the table holds up a 3. They say, I think this is a 3-point story, but one guy holds up a 5 and one guy holds up a 1. So the person who holds up the 5 needs to explain why they think this is more difficult, and the person who held up a 1 needs to explain why they think it's trivial. And either the rest of the team will convince them to come back to 3, or they will convince the rest of the team to go up or down, depending. But it's important that the team has a consensus on an estimate for the story. I've been talking about points, you may have noticed. I didn't say 15 hours or 2 days or anything like that. Under Scrum, we estimate stories with points that rate the relative effort of the work, not the time to complete. That estimate is relative to other well-understood work. So what you're saying is actually, is this more or less complicated than that story that we do understand? So, you know, we did that story and we said that was a 5. Is this more complicated than a 5? Okay, well then we'll point this accordingly. This is one of those things where the more you do it, the better you get. But it's a way of using an abstract estimating system to avoid falling into the pitfall of, oh yeah, the architect, he could get that job done in 2 hours, but the intern would need a full week. By not attaching time to it, by only talking about how complicated it is, we avoid this problem. The architect should be able to acknowledge that while this may be trivially easy for him, it is still a difficult problem for anyone else. And finally, estimates are going to be inaccurate until the team establishes a common baseline, and that's going to take a few sprints. This is one of those things when I'm working with a team that is about to adopt Scrum for the first time, I warned them up front, your estimates are going to be wildly wrong for the first couple of sprints. And that's fine. That's a learning process. You're gonna work through it. But after a few sprints, they should settle down, and what you will find is estimating with story points gets way more accurate than estimating with time when you're doing it as a team and you're applying the discipline to learn from week to week. So after we do backlog grooming, we're going to do sprint planning. Sprint planning is when the team determines the sprint's capacity and pulls stories from the product backlog. Duration is going to be 2 hours per week of sprint. So a 2-week sprint is going to have a 4-hour meeting. But if you're just getting started, newer teams may need more time. I often tell teams that are just getting started with Scrum to go ahead and double it. Maybe even make it a full day planning session. That feels like a lot, but you almost always find that you have a lot to talk about and a lot of questions to ask. And that'll get faster over time, but at first, give yourself the room to take the time you need. This is always going to happen on the first day of the sprint. And the attendees, again, are going to be the entire Scrum team. But this meeting is kind of the opposite of the backlog grooming, where the backlog grooming's purpose was for the dev team to help the product owner. The purpose of the sprint planning is for the product owner to help the dev team plan their work. This is the dev team's meeting. They are responsible for it, and the outcome of it is going to be that their work is planned, but they need help from the product owner to guide their decisions. During sprint planning, you're going to determine the capacity for the sprint. You're going to do that by reviewing velocity. We'll talk about that in a second. User stories are going to be pulled in order from the top of the backlog. This is why the product owner is responsible for keeping the backlog ordered, is so that the dev team doesn't have to ask, what's the most important task? They know the closer it is to the top of the backlog, the more important it is to do right at this moment. And then the team is going to take those user stories and break them down into tasks for the sprint backlog. So this is where you go from that abstract sentence, as a user, I want a feature for a benefit, and you're going to turn it into an actionable ticket in your task system. So, if you're using Jira, you're going to create tickets that say, go add this function and go update the database and go do this. But they're all referring back to that user story. And finally, you're going to define a sprint goal to provide context and guidance to the team. Now, sometimes your sprint goal is just going to be do as much work as we can in this sprint. That's fine. But the reason that we talk about this and the reason we think about it is sometimes your sprint goal is going to be very, very unambiguous. For example, big client X is launching in 2 weeks. So any ticket that is related to big client X is top priority. That helps the development team, because if they're in the middle of the sprint and they find themselves working on something that is unrelated to big client X, they probably need to change course and make sure that they're focusing on the sprint goal. Okay, so what's a sprint backlog? We talked about the product backlog. Well, the sprint backlog is an ordered list of tasks created from user stories accepted into the current sprint. So it's like the product backlog, but it is targeted to just the work you are expecting to get done in this sprint. The stories must be estimated, and they must contain clear acceptance criteria. And this is an opportunity for the development team to push back on the product owner. If the product owner has come to them with badly written user stories and it's not clear how to do the work and it's not clear what the acceptance criteria is, the development team has every right to push back and say, we cannot accept this story into the sprint. It's not ready for us to work on. Once the sprint starts, the sprint backlog should not change because the dev team is making an informed commitment to deliver this body of work. That informed commitment is, we know that our sprint velocity is 27 points, and we've taken 27 points of work into our backlog. If you put more work into our backlog, we can't commit to getting it done. Now, a brief word. A lot of times when I give this presentation, people ask, well, what about bugs? What about P0 interruptions, like, the server's on fire. Everybody's got to drop everything and deal with that. That stuff is going to happen. Thankfully, there's a very clear answer to this, which is anything that is a P0, anything that is an all hands on deck situation, drop everything, this is critical, you're gonna do that. You might drag it into the current sprint, but you need to reflect the fact that the dev team has not been working on the backlog, they've been working on the P0. But bugs are usually not P0. If you've got a bug and it's not a P0, it should probably just be filed into the sprint backlog and should not affect the current sprint. And this can be uncomfortable sometimes. You might get like, hey, the CEO noticed that there's a typo on the homepage. Okay, great. Put it in the backlog. We will prioritize it and get it done in the next sprint. The longest that the CEO will have to wait is 2 weeks. But it's not likely that anybody's going to tell you this typo is a P0. This typo is costing us money. Unless it's a P0, it should not affect the current sprint. Okay, we talked about velocity a little bit. Velocity is very simple. It is a measure of the amount of work that a Scrum team can complete during a single sprint. And we calculate this as a rolling average of the story points completed in previous sprints. So it takes several sprints before a useful velocity metric can be determined. But you can see how, as a rolling average, it becomes more accurate over time. That first sprint, you're just going to guess. The second sprint, you know how much work you did in the first sprint, but that might be an aberration. It might have been an unusually productive sprint, or it might have been an unusually unproductive sprint. By the third sprint, you have 2 sprints of data. Then so on and so on. With each sprint, that number is going to get more accurate and more predictable. I often get asked, like, should we reduce the velocity to account for vacations and stuff? And the answer is, you shouldn't have to. Your rolling velocity should factor that in for you, because people get sick, people take vacations. It will be part of your overall velocity over time. And one more point I like to make, which is velocity is only for planning. Team success should be based on value delivered. And what I'm getting at here is, you don't ever want to get in a contest where different teams are going, well, our velocity is 27 points, well, our velocity is 48 points. It doesn't matter, because your velocity is based on your story points, which are a completely abstract value that is going to be different from team to team. Story points are not the same thing. They are a relative unit of measurement. So your velocity is also a relative unit of measurement that is specific to your sprint team. It is completely pointless to compare velocity between teams. So I want to show you guys real fast a velocity chart. If you use Jira, you'll see something like this. What this is showing you is, on the y-axis here we have story points. On the x-axis here we have each sprint that this team has done. The gray bar represents the sprint commitment. So that's how many story points they agreed to do during that sprint. And the green bar is how many story points they actually delivered. These are tickets that were closed. What I love about this chart is you can tell a lot about this team just by glancing at it. First of all, their numbers are all over the place. This is a team that is having some difficulty with estimation, and if I was going to come into this team, the first thing I would do is kind of break them down a bit on their estimation process and, really force them to get a little bit more strict. We see that they're taking, probably an average of 25 to 30 story points per sprint. But here in sprint 13, they took almost 50 story points. That's madness. And you can see it's madness because they didn't come anywhere close to delivering it. But they've also struggled to deliver what they've committed to. In sprint 9, they took less than 30 story points, but they only delivered like 14. So the story that you're seeing here is their rolling average is going to be dropping over time because it's based on the story points delivered. So they've been committing to about 30 story points on average, but their velocity is going to be more like 15 to 20 because it's the average of those low weeks and those high weeks. So you can see how it kind of like self-corrects over time. All right, this brings us to our third Scrum ritual, the daily stand-up, the Scrum meeting itself. This is a meeting where the dev team is going to plan their work for the next 24 hours and checks progress towards the sprint goal. This meeting is a 15-minute time-boxed meeting. It's going to happen every day. The attendees are the dev team and the Scrum Master. The product owner technically doesn't have to come to this meeting, although literally every company I've ever worked at, the product owner attends it because, naturally they want to know what the team is up to. If anyone other than these people are present in the meeting, for example, if an engineering manager wants to come to the meeting, the Scrum Master has a job to ensure that they do not disrupt the meeting. This meeting is for the dev team to check their progress towards the sprint goal. It is not for them to give a status update. It is not for them to justify the hours they've spent. It is not for the engineering manager to make sure that people are doing their work. This is for the dev team to make sure that they are making progress. So how do they check their progress? They are going to answer the 3 questions. We'll talk about those in a moment. They're going to review the burn down chart. We'll talk about that in a moment too. And as I just said, this is a meeting for the dev team, not a detailed status report for management. If there are any blockers, they should be escalated to the Scrum Master. You might remember that this is one of the Scrum Master's job, is to resolve blockers. And it's not that the Scrum Master necessarily has the power to resolve these blockers. It's that the Scrum Master tries to resolve it so that the developer is free to work on development. If the developer is blocked on task A, they can tell the Scrum Master and move on to task B while the Scrum Master tries to unblock task A. So, what are the 3 questions? The 3 questions are, what did I do yesterday that helped the dev team meet the sprint goal? What will I do today to help the dev team meet the sprint goal? And do I see any impediments, any blockers that will prevent me or the dev team from meeting the sprint goal? You might have noticed I've highlighted that will meet the sprint goal. A problem that I have often seen with stand-up meeting is it becomes justify your salary time. You end up with developers who are paranoid that people are going to feel like they're not earning their paycheck, and they give lengthy updates like, oh yeah, well, I wrote an email and I was in a meeting and I swept out the break room and I did some dishes and I wrote a bunch of tickets. You know, all of those are fine. I'm happy for you. But none of them are relevant to the sprint goal. Everything you say in stand-up meeting should be about, is our team going to be able to deliver the commitment that we've made to the product owner? And one of the ways that you're going to check that is by looking at a burn down chart. A burn down chart shows the work completed over time compared to an ideal trend line. Looking at this can be a useful way to make sure that you're on track. We'll talk about these as I pull up the chart. So this is an example of a burn down chart. Again, on the y-axis, we see the number of story points, and on the x-axis, we see the number of days in the sprint. And what you're seeing here is that blue line, that guideline, is the ideal progress from at the start of the sprint, this team has 11 story points of work to do, to at the end of the sprint, they should have 0 story points remaining. So ideally, there is a steady progress downwards. The orange line is the actual remaining progress. And what you see here is, a kind of stair-step effect, because a developer will close a story. You can see here on day 1, someone closed a story worth 1 point and it dropped from 11 to 10. Then they closed a story worth 2 points. It dropped from 10 to 8, etc. The things that you want to watch out for, there are 2 things that should immediately stand out to you on a burn down chart. One is if you see huge cliffs. If you see a huge cliff, that probably tells you that the story was too large. It was a many point story. Usually you want to break those big stories up into smaller, more granular stories so that you can see them on the burn down chart that the developer is making progress. And the other thing you want to watch out for is if that orange line ever extends past the guideline, that tells you that the team is not closing tickets fast enough. They are in danger of missing their sprint commitment. So yeah, every day during stand-up, you should review the burn down chart and ask the 3 questions. And at the end of stand-up, the dev team should be able to confidently answer, are we on course to deliver the work we've committed to? Okay, we're almost done here. There are 2 remaining Scrum rituals. Both of these come at the end of the sprint. So what we talked about so far is the stuff that happens at the beginning of the sprint to plan for it. We've talked about the daily ritual to make sure that we're on target. Now we're going to talk about the 2 things that happen at the very tail end of the sprint. First of all comes sprint review. This is an informal demonstration of what was achieved by the team to the product owner and other stakeholders. This meeting is 30 minutes per week of sprint, so it'll be an hour for a 2-week sprint. It's going to happen on the last day of the sprint. The attendees are going to be the Scrum team and key stakeholders invited by the product owner. If you're working on an internal product, you may invite key stakeholders such as upper management. If you're working on client deliverables, the key stakeholders maybe a representative from the client who comes into the office every 2 weeks to attend the sprint review and see the work that was delivered. And the purpose of this meeting is to demonstrate the work and also to get feedback on the work. During the review, you want to focus on the product, not the process. So we're not talking about how we did the work. We're talking about the actual delivered work. You're talking about the features that were completed. Work must be fully demonstrable and meet the team's definition of done to be complete and considered ready to put in the review. Sometimes you run into a team who's like, oh man, like I really want us to be able to demonstrate the user login feature. We've been working on it for 2 sprints and the client is really chomping at the bit to see it. But if it's not done, you can't show it. The review is only for completed, done work. And one of the things you want to do during the review is you want to celebrate. This sounds kind of silly, but I feel like in our tech culture, we don't often take the time to celebrate the work that we've done. This is a formalized opportunity to look around as a team and recognize the work you've done and be happy about it. Be proud of the work you've delivered. And last of all, you're going to gather feedback, which should channel back into the product backlog. A really common thing is you put up that user login system and the client goes, oh, wow, this is great, but could you add an email field to the registration form? That way we can send out our newsletter to all the people who've registered for our product. That's great. That's a new feature request. We'll go put it in the product backlog and we'll work on it during an upcoming sprint. The companion meeting to this is the sprint retrospective. And this is a review of what did and did not go well with actions to make the next sprint better. This meeting is going to be 30 minutes per week of sprint. So again, 1 hour for a 2-week sprint. It's going to happen on the last day of the sprint. The attendees are just the Scrum team, and the Scrum guide is actually very clear about this. Managers are not invited to the retrospective, and that's specifically because it is critical that the team feels that they can honestly discuss the challenges they are facing. And often engineers, especially junior engineers, don't feel comfortable talking about things that are not going well in front of the person who controls their salary. So the attendees should be the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the dev team, and explicitly should not include any engineering managers. The purpose of this meeting is to review and improve process. And again, this is the inversion of the other one. The focus on this meeting is on improving the process, not the product. In this case, we're not talking about the features that we shipped or didn't ship. We're talking about whether or not the Scrum process is serving us well. And if not, what changes could we make to it? This is not a time for complaints without action. You don't want to show up to this meeting and go, I don't like the way Bill chooses gum. Unless you have a recommendation for him, I guess, don't chew your gum that way. But a better example is, I feel like we've been getting a lot of tickets that don't have clear acceptance criteria on them. So we want to make sure that as a team, we're putting more emphasis on A, helping the product owner putting acceptance criteria into each of the tickets, and B, making sure that we don't accept stories that don't have acceptance criteria. This is an opportunity to reflect on what went well during the sprint. Sometimes people kind of gloss over this. They're like, oh yeah, that stuff went well. We don't have to talk about it. But it's worth acknowledging and talking about it in this meeting, specifically so that the team can continue to do that, can continue to focus on the stuff that they are doing well. But of course, it's also an opportunity to find out what's not working and use that time to find creative solutions and develop an action plan for how to address it. Okay, that was a lot. Let's recap. This is a great chart that I found that I did not put up at the beginning because I think it's really confusing if you're not already familiar with Scrum. But now that we've talked about it, I think it should make sense to everyone. So we're going to start at the left here we've got a product backlog, and you can see the little circular arrow there indicating that the product backlog is kind of constantly being churned and updated and reorganized. From the product backlog, we go to sprint planning, and the output of sprint planning is we create a sprint backlog. The sprint backlog is given to the Scrum team, who cycle through the daily Scrum rituals and churn on this work for the duration of the sprint until we get to the end of the sprint, the output of which is a delivered increment of work. We're going to have the sprint review to make sure that that increment of work is acceptable to the stakeholders. And then from the sprint review, we're going to go to the sprint retrospective, where we're going to talk about whether our process is working and whether there's anything we want to do differently during the next sprint. And then we go back to sprint planning and start it all over again. So remember, I mentioned at the beginning that everything in Scrum was driven by these 3 values, and they sounded kind of abstract, but they were actually really important. Let's circle back to them real fast. Transparency. Everything in Scrum happens in the open. The product owner doesn't have a secret product backlog that they surprise you with features from. You don't have unexpected deadlines. But conversely, the development team doesn't have secretive process for estimating how work is done. The product owner is there and sees the dev team talking about work and why it's complicated and why things are taking so long. Everything is open and visible. Inspection. We're going to meet on a daily basis at the stand-up to make sure that we're meeting our commitments. We're going to meet on a once a sprint cycle for our backlog grooming and our sprint planning to inspect our artifacts and make sure that they're working. And we're going to meet at our retrospective and our review to ensure that the work we did was up to par. And finally, adaptation. If something isn't working, we're going to change course. The product owner has an opportunity to constantly reorder the product backlog to make sure we're always working on the most important stuff. The team is going to discuss whether the process is working for them, and they're going to make changes if it's not. At any given point, you have an opportunity to inspect and adapt and make sure that the process is serving you. That's all I've got for you guys today. If you want to learn more, this first link here for the Scrum Guide, this is the official Scrum Guide by the fellas that created Scrum back in the day. This second link is kind of a helpful table that just kind of summarizes what are the Scrum rituals all about. And last of all, Atlassian's Scrum Guide is actually very good. I was really surprised going through it. This is very approachable. They talk a little bit about how to make Scrum work in Jira, but this is mostly approachable for people regardless of what tools you use. All right, thank you very much for your time.